Date with a Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art podcasts co-production recorded on Awabakal Country. And I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people tuning in. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. On with the show. Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journey to publication. If you are looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, author of When Men Cry and your host for today's show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. If you enjoy the show, or indeed any other shows on the Words and Nerds platform, jump online and give us a thumbs up, a 5-star review, wherever you are listening. Thank you for listening to us and for supporting the Australian book industry. You can also find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. In today's episode, I'm joined by Jordan Prosser, who is a writer, filmmaker, and performer from Victoria. His films have been screened at multiple festivals around the world and won several international accolades. And he's also a writer, having work published in Mianjin and winning the 2022 Peter Carey Short Story Award. But we're here today to talk about his debut novel, Big Time, published by University of Queensland Press. I started off by asking Jordan about how he turned to music as one of the creative driving forces behind the creation of the book, and also the experience of holding a physical copy of his book in his hand for the first time ever. Jordan, welcome to Date with the Debut.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for having me.
It is great to have you here. And I'm particularly excited because normally, I've had so many books on this podcast, and I have always loved music. And personally, in my own head, whenever I have done a project, music, or whether like a writing project or any sort of other project, music is intrinsic to that. Playlists while I'm writing. Having artists that I collaborate with when I publish a book and put it out there in the world, there has to be a playlist or an album that goes with it. Just because music sets a scene. It's as one of the, similarly to visual film and books in different ways, it connects us in certain ways, shapes and forms. It gives us a new experience, a heightened experience in which to enjoy life and the senses that we have. I know you've done a lot of video, film work and screenwriting. What drew you to music for this book?
Well, jealousy, basically. It is still I've worn a lot of hats, as you say. I've worked for about 10 years in film and television. I've worked in advertising. I was an actor for a long time. And the one thing I've never really done, but I've always desperately wanted to do ever since I was very, very young, was be in a band, because I still just think it's the coolest thing. So it's still that kind of like rarefied experience for me, something that I love. I love going to gigs. And there's a lot of gigs that have been very sort of formative to me throughout my life. So I think it's just that kind of reverence for those artists. And especially given I have so little personal experience of it, it actually felt quite exciting to explore and to play around in that space. And then other than that, I just think it's such a great archetypal sort of character dynamic. Like there are so many stories about 4-piece bands in pop culture. Like it's kind of a great shorthand in a way. It immediately sets up the backstory. It immediately sets up conflict when you have these 4 people who are kind of, living in each other's pockets, and you've got what happens on tour, and you've got them being forced to collaborate, and then obviously exploring the fallout, what happens when it all goes wrong. So yeah, it was never really a conscious decision. I think I was never like, spinning a wheel and deciding what kind of artists they would be in the book. It was always just like, oh yeah, it's a band on tour. Because that also then gives you the road trip structure, the road trip narrative, which is another one of my favorites.
Yes, well, there is a sneaky road trip in this book, and I will say we will try and keep it as spoiler free as we can, because shortly the answer is for all of our listeners: go read the book. We want you to go and buy it because that's awesome. But I will say, do you have a lot of band friends? Because the reason why I ask that is I do have family and friends who have had long careers in the music industry, and on the subject of capturing the band experience of it's like a weird marriage is kind of a great way to describe it, like between four people with no sex, or sometimes there is sex. Ask Fleetwood Mac or ABBA.
Quite often, yeah.
Yes, but I felt I did connect with that feeling of not just when everyone talks about, for example, even the thing of creative differences, how that can manifest as well, just some of the chaos that ensues, and why it is such a it's such a personal thing, because being creative is very much it becomes from a very personal place, which means that creating music and stuff like this leads to the famous fights that you hear about and the famous band fallouts that are all such a thing. But you captured that experience brilliantly. It felt
great,
just from my own. Yeah, do you have band friends? How did you research that and pull that together? I just need to know.
I do have friends to this day who play in bands. In fact, my partner, two of my partner's brothers are in a Melbourne band called Have Hold, and they were kind enough to let me sit in on their sessions, and one of her brothers read the whole manuscript and sort of fact checked and gave me some really great little you wouldn't use that time signature, it would be mastering, not mixing at this stage, etc., to sort of get the terminology accurate. But apart from that, yes, I've always known people in bands. I've always gone along to friends' bands. I've made music videos for friends' bands. So I've always kind of been on the periphery, at least, of those groups and of those kinds of artists. None quite so famous, or none in such a state of implosion as the ones in my book. For that, there were a couple of really great resources. I read a book called Our Band Could Be Your Life, which is by a music journalist called Michael Azara, and that sort of documents the rise of the indie and West Coast punk scene in America between the 80s and the 90s. And it's just a chapter about each band. And you've got some amazing stories about how they formed and all the drug problems and the falling out and the disputes with the labels. And then I just watched 4 or 5 times. There's a Metallica documentary called Some Kind of Monster, which is just about the recording of this one. Yeah. And when you have these musicians who are stratospherically famous, who are just at the absolute top of their game, and of that really, really high profile, when they're still being forced to work together after 20 years or something they'd been together when this documentary was being made, and some of the interactions are just almost inhuman,
charged.
The way they kind
very
of
charged.
but then seeing the way that the music still comes out of that, you can have 4 people who hate each other so much, and yet then you put them in a studio together and count them in, and they just play the greatest music you've ever heard in your life. So it's really amazing to me. The pressure cooker, and in that sense, I don't think it's too dissimilar from other groups of artists that are forced to work together. I see the band dynamic as being similar to a film set, which is where I've spent a lot of time. Similar to the cast and crew backstage on a play, which is where I've spent a lot of time. It really just has to do with the art you're making and the number of people involved. But people who you kind of by choice or by default are forced to work together to make something great, putting their differences aside or letting the differences get the better of them. It's a dynamic I love and I'm fascinated by.
It's such a evocative space. I mean, the first things I think of are the stories of say Oasis at Rockfield Studios, where they had a massive fight and literally recorded, What's the Story, Morning Glory in 12 days. And I mean, God, I really want to pick up that book now about, the growth of the West Coast music that you mentioned on the West Coast, the story of the growth of grunge out in Seattle. and also like subpar and like the label and all of that stuff is so interesting. I could honestly literally just get sidetracked and talk to you about musical history all day, but I know that we actually have a book to talk about. I know, but it's the reason. Again, this is the reason why I really gravitated towards this book, because worked a little bit in music publishing myself and have a lot of family and friends in music, so I just love this shit. But there was last question I do want to ask before we dive into Big Time. And that is the fact that we're recording this in mid-June right now. The book comes out on the 2nd of July. Likely that people will be listening to this after the book is out in the world. But today you're going to go down and literally grab a physical copy of your book for the first time.
I am.
That feels weird. Does that feel weird?
It's super weird. It's super weird because I've actually just been overseas for about a month. And I've come back and I'm in Sydney. I'm not actually at home now. I'm in a hotel. And over the past 5 weeks, the book was printed and finished. And so I've been getting photos of it. And I've started seeing book talkers and people on Instagram unwrapping it. And I've seen my publisher reposting videos of them unwrapping it. And so everywhere I look, there seem to be these physical copies of my book popping up. But I've been overseas, so I haven't got one yet. So I haven't actually picked it up or touched it. But I'm about to go. As soon as I finish speaking with you, I'm going to go and meet my publicist, Sarah from UQP, and I'm told she will bring a couple of copies, and I can just hold them in my hand.
Yeah, we were talking about before we started recording, but it's a weird feeling. And then we're like, as mentioned, like when we were chatting beforehand, I had an experience with Naima Brown, who wrote The Shot last year, and had her on the show and talked about it. I was on my honeymoon in Fiji, and I had taken The Shot with me again because I just wanted to read it again. Because when you're doing this show, you're kind of speed reading and going through the book as quickly as you can because you want to pull the questions out and stuff. And then this time, like, I'm going to do a slow read and digest this book. And I get to this random island in Fiji in the middle of nowhere. And lo and behold, I discover that there's a library there with a very small library just on a wall. And there's her book just right, sitting there. And then there's a copy of my book that I have. I took a photo and sent it to her and said, look, I'm on a random island in the middle of nowhere and 2 of your books have ended up here. The journey that it's been on is weird. She was like, that's weird to me. So the journey that your book is going to go on is very strange. In the world.
Yeah. I hope it shows up in that library.
Enough of talking about musical theory and random book experiences. Let's talk about Big Time, which I'm holding a physical copy of in my hand right here. And I find it so strange that I am doing that before you are. So tell us, everyone, to all the people who are not familiar, what is Big Time about?
Big Time is it's set in a not too distant sort of alternate version of Australia in the early 2040s. At a point where the eastern states, so along the 129th meridian, the eastern states have closed their borders completely to the rest of the world, sealed themselves off, and become the world's newest sort of fledgling fascist autocracy. And in this fledgling country in Melbourne, there's a band called The Acceptables, a sort of pop rock band, who hit it really, really big with their first album a few years ago. Tour the country, they're as famous as you can get in this new country, and so they're getting ready to record their second and record and tour their second album. The bass player for the band, Julian Ferryman, our protagonist, I wouldn't say hero, but protagonist, he returns to Melbourne after a year spent overseas. He sort of disappeared as soon as they'd finished recording their first album, and now he's come back for the second. And at the same time he arrives back in Melbourne, he gets his first taste of a new synthetic hallucinogenic drug, which is known as F. It's a liquid. When applied to the user's eyeballs, gives them a glimpse of their own future. And the rumor says that the more F you take, the further into the future you see. Rumor says that the people who have actually overdosed on F have seen to the very end of time, right before they die. So the whole band are experimenting with and sort of getting hooked on this new drug. They set off on their tour. The tour immediately goes off the rails. And around the same time, Julian is sort of recruited for an underground rebellion that is seeking to overthrow the totalitarian regime. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Yes, we don't want to go too far into too many spoilers because, the best way to describe this, I mean, it's kind of already mentioned at the top, but I feel like it is the correct way to describe it. It is psychedelic. This is literally and figuratively a drug trip of a story, and such a great. I love myself some loaded, provocative stories, so of course you played my heart like a fiddle with when you dived into that stuff. But the first thing, of course, I want to look at is the actual. You do make a lot of comments about art itself in the story. First and foremost, is kind of the first thing that I gravitated towards. There's a bit of a satiring and examining of art and how art perceives the world, and how art looks at it, as well as how art changes over the passage of time, and of course the Acceptables are very much trying to do their own thing, and very much there is an element of resistance to them, kind of that's already seeped a little bit into the band. With the people, the higher ups that they have to kind of deal with and manage. And whenever I think of kind of people who immediately I go to the look to people in the past who rebelled against that sort of stuff, like Prince or Zappa or Captain, or the chaos of Captain Beefheart. And then when they went on tour, there was also just, I didn't want to say an element of Spinal Tap, of like things going off the rails and chaotic, but obviously that's a bit more comedic than it was than this particular one. Given that you have worked in many different fields, both in writing and film, I've got a sense, and I didn't want to be all psychoanalysis on you, but you had some interesting things to examine about the actual creative process and all of that space.
And around the function of art and artists. I think I'd probably say up front, and we'll probably end up touching on this a fair bit. A lot of this book, even though it doesn't talk about it explicitly, this book was written, and I think personally was very much a response to COVID. Most of it was written during lockdowns, and so if anything, I think a few years on, like I'm probably in a better place now. Like hopefully a lot of people are. There is. I think the book is torn. I think this is writ large in the book, but the book is very much torn between a deep and abiding love for art and artists, and a very strong skepticism about their value and about their utility. And I think, to return to COVID, that's because if you think about that first year, 2020, it's like all the stuff that felt like it was having an actual meaningful impact, all the stuff that felt like it was driving social change, none of it was coming from established, celebrated celebrity artists. What did they give us? Like that god awful Imagine video, that's what we had. That's what we had to subsist on. And it seemed very much during that time, like, I think that very much for general audiences, that really reinforced the idea that art is there simply to placate, to numb, to comfort. We were all just kind of like sinking into our couches and just like consuming content. This is not to say that there is not still powerful art that can change minds. I guess it's a question of the individual versus the collective. I think I'm skeptical of how much individuals can drive change now. I think change happens on a collective level. I think it comes from movements, from groups. I think individual artists in many ways feel it's too risky now. Like Taylor won't even endorse Biden, because it's seen as kind of a financial risk. So so the idea of an individual artist still being able to spearhead a movement and spark social change, it's something that I think is at least very much in flux, and has been for a number of years now. Yeah.
It reminded me of a simple, like, sometimes when I'm looking at other books, I look at other pieces of art that have played a similar mindset to me. And an experience that I had was there's a record that came out from Jack White called Boarding House Reach, which is a fantastic examination of the commodification of art and the corporate nature of art. And I often found myself sometimes when I was in that mindset reading the book, playing a couple of songs like from that about the actual, because he really breaks down the creative process and just talks about how, and it's a chaotic album as well. Like he clearly had reached the point of gone past the point of giving a fuck around trying to make his own sound work, and it became a piece about how artists in effect are corrupted and managed by the corporate desires that are kind of out there in the world. And more importantly, I think a key point that I took from the record is, because everyone talks, for example, about rock music, how rock music isn't necessarily the zeitgeist anymore. It's not as good as it once was, or it's not as focused in the mainstream as it should be. And the minds, and kind of going back to that point that you were alluding to about, the individual versus the collective. I mean, sometimes an individual can inspire a movement, but it is completely dependent wholly on whether the artist or not is willing to take it there and really go out on a limb a little bit. Yeah. Because, for example, this record for me, I was like, it's chaotic. It's all over the place. And I love it because of how much he's willing to throw himself out there as an example. And that artistic discussion that you again allude to in this book with the nature of where the acceptables are, it's so loaded is a great way to describe it.
And I think that's really key is like, so much of art has become so commodified. And if you follow the paychecks all the way up, inevitably you get to some like, horrific parent company that has only people's worst interests at heart. So it's like you really kind of have to actually pick apart people's intentions behind making work, I think. And the sort of the widening gap, I think, between art and content is another really useful sort of metric for whether or not you should be letting art guide your principles, whether or not you should be letting it inform your decisions in life.
Absolutely. There is one other thing within this side of things that I want to talk about, and that is kind of the more directly psychedelic element of this book, and that is the drug, which is this F drug that Julian kind of takes and goes on crazy adventures with, seeing the future and how it will look. And I will say some of those moments in the book where Julian is under the influence of this hallucinogen are fascinating and at times a bit and my first question on this particularly is, what the hell is it with drugs and the creative process? With some of them it is clear because that process, for example, if you're a musician and you're playing 80,000 people, the high is incomparable, and sometimes you have to take drugs to supplement that kick. But what is it with it, and particularly with this particular drug, where similar, I remember my first thoughts when you were injecting into the eye, it immediately made me think of Looper. There's a drug, like a movie, 2013 movie Looper, where Joseph Gordon-Levitt did something similar, and immediately his eye, he was just seeing the world in a whacked out sort of way, in a chaotic sort of way. What is it with that particular element of the creative environment?
I think it's just about perception, really, and I feel like I was giving artists a very bad rap in my response to that last question. I do think that, but I do think that like artists are naturally inclined more towards seeing outside of established systems. They're more inclined towards being open and accepting of change, and ultimately I think that's just an act of imagination. And what is a drug if not a means of boosting your imagination, reducing your inhibition, and allowing you to see further outside a pre-existing framework, whether that framework is an institution or whether that framework is reality itself. I think it's just the willingness to expand your mind, as as they said in the 60s. I don't know. I went to a lot of music festivals in my 20s, man. I've never done ayahuasca, but yeah, it's something that's so ingrained, I think, in the culture of music making and art making, for better and for worse. And yeah, I just loved the idea of you read those sort of music books and you watch those music biographies, and it's like every band kind of has. You look at the Beatles, for instance, like, oh, well, this was just their like. Suddenly they discovered marijuana, and it's like, this is what the music does all of a sudden. And suddenly they discovered this, and it's like you can kind of delineate different artistic movements basically by just what the drug of choice was at the time. And so I liked the idea of having this, this fictional band and this completely brand new drug of choice, and sort of how that informs the art and music of that era.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is actually a really good segue, because we've obviously set this subtext up in terms of the story, because it leads us nicely to talking about Julian and the band as they're making this record of this second album that they're then going to go out and tour. I can see that there was a pulling from a lot of previous musical history, as well as from the creative people that you probably had who looked over it. Julian is he's such a fascinating lens to perceive this world, and that's not, and even before you throw drugs into the mix, and particularly considering, we'll get to that kind of discussion about fate and the world that we live in, and how you kind of wind that through very nicely. But tell me about Julian and this band, and this dynamic band of this dynamic foursome.
Well, I already said a lot of it is sort of drawn from, the bands I used to hang out with, people I went to university with, the little, the gigs and garages that I would go to, kind of that, like the Melbourne band scene circa 2007 to 2012. Like all the characters are just various amalgamations of those people and the artists and musicians I knew around that time. But I think another thing that really interests me is how art is inherent, like the ability to make art is inherently a privilege, and how funny it is when you see these like Melbourne grammar kids strutting around in pretend torn jeans, like pretending to be poor, as an excuse to sort of make their music and art. And that's what I think is kind of funny, is kind of. That's why all the characters in the band are sort of satirical in themselves, because they're all supposed to be these incredibly privileged, like, inner city kids, because they've lived this very, very sheltered existence. And the question in the book becomes like, where you inevitably have the scales fall from your eyes and sort of see the world for what it truly is, you have a choice. You can turn your back on it, and you can lean back into nostalgia and comforts and the things that you've always known, or you can run straight towards it, and you can be a part of it, as sticky and uncomfortable and ugly and painful as it might be. And so within the band and within their wider entourage, the whole sort of ensemble group of characters in the book, you have every different kind of response in that. You have the people who completely lean into it and try and fight and try and change the world, and then you have the people who like Julian, I suppose. What do you do on a hero's journey when the hero just continuously rejects the call? Like, when he has no interest really in being a part of the new world, and yet he's the one who's sort of been called upon.
Tell me a little bit more about Julian, because I mean, more for like he did feel like the right lens to view this world through, because not because of his own active resistance to it, but he also seemed like there was some moments, again, as you kind of allude to, where other members of the band and the entourage were kind of very much leaning into this space, and he often with his lens and as the narrator provides a very reliable counterpoint, or unreliable, depending on where he is. Why did Julian feel like the right person? Just tell me a bit about him.
I think Julian in many ways is kind of my way of interrogating something I've been feeling basically since I turned 30. And that is like a fear of my own sort of creeping conservatism, I suppose. And I'm talking purely about, like cultural conservatism. in that you always think like when I was talking to a friend of mine about this the other day, you always think when you're young, you're like, man, I'm never gonna be out of touch. I'm never gonna say no to anything. I always want to be on the cutting edge. I always want to be on the front foot. And then inevitably things change, and I think it's very, very human, and it's very natural to kind of resist that change, because there's just stuff you love, and you just want that stuff to last forever. And as soon as you realize it doesn't, you just naturally begin to dig your heels in, and it becomes a conscious, active choice to actually continue to be a part of an evolving, functioning, changing, and mutating culture, I think. And the little part of me that was like, can't we just keep doing what we always did? Like, whether it's in music or film or what have you. Because I worry that instinct leads to worse instincts, leads to far worse, not just aesthetic, but societally damaging conservatism. It's maybe easy to say, oh, you just like the old Ghostbusters movie, or, oh, The Last Jedi ruined my childhood. But I really don't think it's actually that far removed from saying that and voting no in the voice referendum. I think they come from a similar place. And I think if you leave one unchecked and you dig your heels in too much, it's really not that hard to end up at that other place. And I'm not personally worried I ever will end up at that place. It's just this feeling of like, oh, sometimes I feel a little bit uncomfortable with like the music and the movies and the stuff that's happening around me. Like, suddenly I don't understand. Like, am I suddenly irrelevant? I think that's a fear that everyone of a certain age experiences. It's something that everybody goes through. And so that's really embodied in Julian. Except he's kind of the worst version of that.
Exactly.
He's the far extreme version of what happens when you dig your heels in.
Yeah, and I mean, I won't lie, I've felt the same way about that that kind of growing conservatism as well. And in my head, I've been like, I need to try and fight that a little bit. But then sometimes I'd be like going and listening to, I don't know, Triple J or something. I'm like, what is this music? And 10 years ago, I'd be like, 10 years ago, I would have been like, oh yeah, this is the shit. And I'm suddenly terrified. It means that I'm old. And
that's a really great example, And so what do you do to change that? Like, do you just listen to Triple J 24/7 as like exposure therapy to try and force yourself to like something? Like, is it okay to just stubbornly say, hey, I like what I like, I don't want anything new, or is that kind of like cauterizing your mind against new impulses and new experiences? I think it's really, really hard to get the balance right.
Yeah. And this leads nicely onto the very last part of the book. Of course, we won't go into spoilers about this rebellion that Julian kind of ends up involved with or coerced into. But it is so interesting that you have obviously set this, and I love having a map in a book. So
me too.
Yeah, me too. Hang on, there we go. So I'm kind of, just for everyone who on the YouTube channel, I'm holding up a map that highlights the world that has been created here, and I love me a map. So it is a good vibe, and I absolutely love it. But the world that you have actually created of Australia, I don't want to. Is it like dystopian? Just like the rise of a very fascist alternative. Well, I don't want to say alternative future. Who knows what may transpire in front of us? But the fact that he kind of is coerced into this rebellion environment. Talk to me a little bit about creating a dystopian future, and also particularly how this particular mindset of, given there is a rise in fascism and a rise in this extreme rhetoric that obviously probably even comes from that place of conservatism that we've been alluding to the entire time, that kind of lingers in the background. There is a theme of this book around fate and determining your own fate and choosing what to accept and go with, and determine where you go with that. And that conservatism point that we've alluded to with Julian is a perfect microcosm of the wider world that has been crafted and created here. Talk me through that, and also the fact that this world is a reflection of that growing space.
Yeah, I think, again, it comes very much from 2020, 2021 just being forced to sit at home and look at what was becoming of the world. And, you know, it was such an inflection point in my life, I think, because I'd had my 20s when I managed to, like, you know, travel a lot and make a lot of art and meet a lot of people. And then it seemed like the world just immediately started getting smaller again. And not just personally, not just because we couldn't leave our homes, but because it seemed like worldwide there was this growing trend towards people becoming insular, this trend towards xenophobia, this trend towards rejecting the unknown in favor of the established and the known. And so that's really what the world of Australia in big time is. It's just that turned up to 11. It's like, what do you do if you literally just shut your country off and say nothing new ever? Like, we like things the way they are. We have everything we need. We will not be taking any new any new people, any new art, any new ideas, anything like that at all. That's really where it stemmed from. But I like the idea too of playing with the idea of like a sort of a slightly new dystopia. Like, it's only been, when the book starts, it's only been about 10 years since the country fully closed off its borders. So life is kind of the same in some ways. And this speaks to the idea of like the journey the characters go on. Like, chapter 1 is a house party. And it's fairly similar to a house party you might go to now, or a house party I might have gone to in the 2010s. It's not until the characters sort of go a little bit beyond their comfort zone you really get the sense of how much things have changed and what's gone wrong. And my favorite saying when it comes to writing sci-fi and writing dystopian futures, I can't remember who said it, so my apologies to whoever's quote I'm stealing here. But you don't imagine the car of the future, you imagine the traffic jam. Like, you imagine not just the shiny, interesting tech that you can point people to and say, hey, look at this new thing. You imagine what happens when it starts to go wrong. So you kind of set it a little bit after the change, a little bit after the new technology's been invented. And that's the same with the drug in this book. You know, it's been on the scene for a little bit, and now it's really about exploring the ripple effects of what it's doing to the characters and what it's doing to the world around them. And then the other part of that question was about time and fate. Sorry, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think time travel, like, I just love time travel stories. I love them so much. They feel like the final boss of storytelling in a way, like for human storytelling, you know, because it's a comparatively a very new device. Time travel stories have only been around for 150 years in their kind of like modern form. And it's a way to completely invert the established rules of cause and effect. And in doing that, there's so much capacity for for what it does to your characters. The idea that someone can actually know their fate and then be given a choice to fight against it or to embrace it. I just love those stories. I always have. I love that there's no right way of doing it. Like, you mentioned Looper before, and there's a great scene in Looper when they sit down, like Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Bruce Willis sit down in a diner, and he's like, so how does this time travel thing work? And Bruce Willis is like, don't bother. Like, it doesn't. Don't worry about it. Like, the entire movie just kind of brushes aside the concept of time travel because it acknowledges that there is no actual there's no right or wrong way to do it. And that's another thing that I love about it, is it's just a giant sandbox that you can play in as a writer, and kind of just offer your take on it, really, which is what I'm doing here.
Well, it is definitely a loaded, juicy take on the future, but also a lot of creative stuff that's amazing, and I could honestly keep poking about it. But for all of our listeners, you have to actually go and read the book because it's a fantastic story. Let's talk a little bit about your story, your journey to publication a little bit, if I can, because we as we kind of alluded to, obviously UQP picked up the book. You have been doing a lot of short story writing. You got stuff published in the engine. And obviously you're kind of, getting yourself familiar with that process. The first question I do want to ask is, because I have a screenwriter here in my midst, I always like to see the comparison of how, short story or book writing compares to the process of crafting and creating something to film, transitioning something to film, when you're thinking about the context of not just you being the writer or the editor, but having an actor and a director take that work and then build on it. But you've also got the context of music and music creation. How does writing this story, writing it compare to those other creative processes?
Well, again, I'll quickly reference COVID in that
Always.
yeah, I know. Sorry, everyone. 2020 and 2021, I've been working this like corporate job to kind of, survive, like so many people were at that time. And I quit in June 2021 because I was like, great, world's back on track. I've saved up a bit of money. I'm going to go all out, like, make some movies. And then a month later, Melbourne went back into, the longest lockdown we'd ever had. And I was like, this is not ideal. And for the last 18 months, of course, everyone had been saying like, will there even be a film industry? Will movies even exist after this? It was not looking good. And I'd been so frustrated and so heartbroken by the last couple of years creatively. I picked up the book and started writing as an outlet, truly just as a creative outlet, because I didn't know whether any screenplays I ever wrote would ever get made ever again. I mean, it's always a risk to begin with, but just in that time, it seemed even less likely. So I was like, why? It would be so great to just write something, because a screenplay is a blueprint at the end of the day. It's not a finished product. They can be beautiful and they are a work of art in themselves, but they're not a finished product. I just wanted something that I could make and I could finish, even if I was the only one who ever read it. I just wanted that feeling, that sense of creative closure. And so that was what led me to pick the book up again. And the differences in writing, I would say, it was an even better outlet than I ever could have anticipated, because the thing that really kills me, I think, especially if you're a screenwriter in Australia, is every word you write has a dollar amount attached to it. You are constantly thinking about budget. You are constantly reshaping and sort of de-scoping your ideas and your imagination to try and fit some imaginary pocketbook. Whereas big time is,
you can play God. You can play God because it's
100%.
Yeah,
it'd be the most expensive film ever made. It's a $400 million movie. You know what I mean? And I could just do that. I could completely let myself go with it. And I just, because I love stories that have this huge scale. I love, like you say, the maps. I love something that hops all around the world. And I could actually do that. So it was so liberating in that sense, and so different from what I was used to. And then the other real main difference, I think, in terms of the work itself, and this is particularly important, I think, for my book, is the control you have over time. If you need to display the passage of time in a screenplay, you don't have a lot of options. You've got a hard cut, you've got a cheesy montage, you've got like, oh, the plants have grown, the character's hair is longer, tricks basically. But in prose, a single sentence can describe a second, or it can describe a century. And there's a lot of that in my book. I think the elasticity of time in prose is one of its most beautiful attributes, one of its greatest tools. And it was such a joy getting to kind of, just wield that with impunity, I think.
There is usually that famous quote that, again, I can't reference the person, so now we're even on that, which is the picture says a picture says 1,000 words, and I have a little addition that I have started to put onto that, which is that the picture says 1,000 words, the right word says 1,000 more, because of the flexibility of the subtext that can be implied. A look, a moment, a thought, a process,
exactly.
An interaction can offer so much more.
And the rule in filmmaking, so often the number one thing they tell you in screenwriting is like, show, don't tell, show, don't tell. And you know what? Sometimes it's great just to tell. It's so great just to be like, the character thought this, without having to come up with some like physical manifestation of it. It was so liberating.
Now that There we are, in fact, out of COVID, thank God. And now that I think there is still an Australian film industry, it still exists.
There is. It
There
does,
is.
thankfully.
And hopefully you are getting more screen work, and that means that you have, more money coming in the door. What is next for you bookwise after Big Time? And I'm fully aware saying this that you were like, okay, I can't wait for this book to be out in the world before we started this recording. But is there another story? Has it inspired you?
Yeah, there's a couple. There's two that I'm working on. One is a real change of pace. It's a much shorter, much more contained sort of human drama. Well, it's a comedy, actually, a sort of lighthearted comedy about anxiety and depression and suicide and going to Mars. that I've been working on now, about the sort of a response to the climate crisis. And then the other one I'm working on is much more similar to Big Time. It's about art and the power of art to kind of heal or destroy. My template for it is kind of the Da Vinci Code.
Ooh, okay.
But about a sort of a fuddy-duddy art historian who gets sucked into a global conspiracy.
Fuddy-duddy art stories. That doesn't sound like us at all. That doesn't sound like artists at all, but that sounds amazing. I love it.
Yeah.
We're now at the last part of the podcast where I hit you with a series of rapid-fire questions. So you give me the first answer that comes to your head.
All right.
And it's super fun, and I absolutely love it. First, I've allowed you to prepare for two particular questions, which you would have heard of before, which is about your book and reading habits. And my first question to you is, what is your favorite book that you have read in the last 12 months?
In the last 12 months, it was one I read just a month ago on my trip, actually. I read a book called Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. She's a British author. A really great addition to one of my favorite subgenres, which is the "they came back wrong" subgenre. A woman's wife goes on a deep sea exploration mission, and it goes wrong, and she disappears for 6 months. And when she comes back from the bottom of the ocean, something has changed. It's a really beautiful, really heartbreaking, and incredibly gross sort of queer love story that's got a lot to do with like deep pressure ocean exploration, which just gives me the heebie-jeebies. Scarier than space.
Oh wow, crazy! That sounds a lot to unpack in that one as well.
Yeah, it's awesome.
What is your favorite debut novel that you've ever read? So we're not talking last 12 months, we're talking ever.
Easy. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Yeah, it's truly absurd that that's her debut novel, because I genuinely think it's one of the finest novels ever written. It's the only book that I probably read at least once every year or two, just as like a palate cleanser, like literally just to remind myself of the beauty and potential of fiction, and to sort of and I think it also touches on a lot of themes that I'm really interested in as well. This idea of like completely subsuming yourself in art. Can you live off art? Can you live off beauty? Can you just like let it destroy you? It's an extraordinary book. I'll never get sick of it.
All right, I'm going to drop that in the description, everyone. You have to go and check that one out as well. You may have already touched on this earlier in the episode, but I'm going to ask you again anyway, in case there's another one. Do you have a favorite quote about creativity?
I don't think I have a favorite quote. The only thing that actually comes to mind, it's not a quote, it's a drawing. So this is not ideal for the audio format. I apologize. Everyone probably will have seen it. Like anyone who's ever worked in like a tech startup, which I unfortunately have, they'll recognize it. It's the idea that it's like a picture of the creative process, and it's basically a giant scribble, like a giant jumble, that then just sort of like shrinks down and gets clearer and cleaner and cleaner until it's just a straight line. it's pretty straightforward, but I do think it rings true. The idea that the creative process is kind of just turning chaos into order in one sense, or learning how to capture chaos. And it's just an important reminder, I think, of when you feel like you're completely at sea at the beginning of something, that eventually one day you'll be, it'll be smooth sailing, and you'll look back and kind of laugh about how difficult it all seemed at some stage.
About all the chaos and struggles that took to get to that creative process.
One day you'll be collecting a copy of your finished book, and you'll go, I remember when I wanted to throw this thing in the trash because it just didn't make any sense, and nothing about it was working. Yeah.
Love it. In the interest of this being about music, what would be your 3 desert island discs?
Oh God, why didn't you tell me about this one before?
Because now we're in the mean section where I throw the harsh questions at you.
My 3 desert island discs. There has to be a Radiohead one on there because I am who I am.
Please tell me it's a Moon-Shaped Pool or In Rainbows. It has to be one of those two, because if those are the.
I think if I can take the double disc version of In Rainbows, it would be that one. If I can get disc 2 as well, but that counts as one.
Yeah, that counts. That counts. I'll give you that
Okay.
Because that album's fire.
Okay. And then I would take something by 9 Inch Nails.
Oh, yeah.
Again, I can't decide which. You're going to have to edit this down for all my thinking and
that's fine.
I'm sorry. This is an impossible question.
9 Inch Nails is good. I like it.
Yeah. Who would I take as the third? I'd take the White Album.
Oh, yes. You went straight to my favorite Beatles album. That was
great. Okay.
You got me so well. Oh wow, shit. I'm gonna need to take a breather after that one. On the subject of that, if you could meet one creative individual, whether it be a writer, whether it be a filmmaker, a musician, the person who you would want to pick their brains for hours over a beer or equivalent beverage of some description, who would it be?
Akira Kurosawa.
Oh, yes. Why? Now I want to know.
I watched Seven Samurai for the first time last year in LA on a beautiful 35mm projection, and it's as good as everyone always says. And he's just even the other sort of great filmmakers all kind of bow down to Kurosawa. I think there's something about the way he makes these almost mythological films that still have these deeply human stories in them. Something about the way he, like I was saying before, organizes chaos into this like beautiful, harmonious order. There's just so much I could pick his brain about, like from the practicalities of shot construction and how you wrangle 1,000 extras into a burning castle, and then how you make it feel so natural at the same time as feeling so enormous and mythical.
That's a great answer. I love that. Last question. You're welcome. If you were on tour with The Acceptables, would you and it did transpire the way that it did, would you lean into the absolute chaos of it, or would you feel like Julian and be in a somewhat resistant mindset? I'd
just get the fuck out of there. I'd be one of the characters who's just like, I'd go and try and make a difference in some other way elsewhere, but be like, I can't be here. I don't need this drama in my life. Sorry, guys. That
is completely fair enough. The reason why I wanted to throw that question in is because, was listening to Noel Gallagher talk about the Be Here Now tour, and he said that, you know, obviously that album is kind of, it has its fans and all of that. He said, look, even though I didn't find the album like the best process, he doesn't personally like, he said that tour that we did was the best time I ever had, even though it was complete and utter chaos and everyone was on cocaine, and it was like just, it was the album was cocaine set to music, but it was the best time I ever had on a tour. So who knows? This has been so much fun, Jordan. Thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you so much for giving us such a loaded, exciting deep dive into dystopian Australia. I'm vibing it. It's good fun. And on top of it, talking music and creativity, you got me. And it's the reason why this podcast has been as long and as fun as it has been. Thank you so much, man. This has been great.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thanks for reading. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut, and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show, or indeed any episode of Words and Nerds, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up. It is hugely appreciated. Catch you soon.